Well, hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Jonathan Tepperman. I'm the editor-in-chief of The Catalyst, which is the nonpartisan policy journal published by the Bush Institute. Thanks for joining us for this Engage event, which is presented by NexPoint. So, as you probably know, we're holding today's discussion to promote the publication of our Winter 2024 issue, which you can find, read, and subscribe to at bushcenter.org/catalyst. Our winter issue focuses on a topic that preoccupies a lot of us these days, and that is the health and the future of American democracy. The issue includes a lot of great articles, including pieces, interviews with both President Bush and Senator Mitt Romney, all of which I hope you'll check out. In the meantime, we have the great good fortune of having two of our authors with us here today, and you can turn on your cameras now. Jane Dailey is joining us from the University of Chicago, where she's a professor of American history and also teaches at the law school. And Ryan Streeter is the executive director for research at the Civitas Institute at the University of Texas at Austin, although he's joining us from Miami today. Thank you both so much for making time to speak with us. I'm going to start by asking you both a few questions about your articles, and then I want to bring in questions from our audience as soon as possible. So, Jane, Ryan, let me start by asking you both a two-part question, but I want you each to just stick to the first half of the question. So each respond to the first half, and then I'll come back to you for the second. Question is simply this: a lot of Americans are worried about the state of our country and our democracy and are pessimistic about our future at the moment. According to one recent poll that a lot of people have been citing, more than 70% of respondents said that they think the country is headed in the wrong direction. My two-part question is, first, are things really so bad? Is this, in fact, the worst moment in the history of American democracy, as a lot of people think? And if yes, why? And then the second question, which we'll get to in a second, is if not, then why do people feel this way? But let's just start with your take. Jane, is this the worst time in American history?
No,
You want to say anything more?
we've cleared that up. No, I mean, there have been lots and lots of times of tremendous anxiety, of unexpected catastrophes. I mean, you can think of the stock market crash, you can think of 9/11, you can think of all kinds of moments when there's been chaos, literally. So no, I don't think this is the worst time for American democracy.
And Ryan, what's your take?
I agree with Jane. I don't think this is the worst that it's been for American democracy. I think you can go back to some of the times that she just cited. The most obvious example being the Civil War. I mean, I think if we could all be transported back to that constitutional crisis, we would probably appreciate just how fragile the country felt at that time. And that seems an obvious one. But you don't even have to go back that far. I mean, I think just about 100 years ago, between the two world wars, at a time where there was a growing prosperity, and you think of the United States had come off of World War I and a global pandemic, something that we didn't spend a lot of time learning about in school, but now identify with very much so, into the roaring 20s. You can go back and read cultural pessimists in the 20s making some of the very same arguments that you hear today, that constitutional checks and balances were falling apart in America. There was a need for kind of a response to growing collectivism in Europe and abroad. The growth and prosperity actually led to lamentations about people being overly materialistic in America, and that we didn't have political institutions that could cope with this excess. And then we went into the Great Depression, when the country really fell in on itself. And a lot of the arguments that were being made back then is that American democracy is not up to the task. Their institutions are not strong enough to deal with these huge challenges. And so that was less than 100 years ago, where you see these arguments being made by the likes of people like Irving Babbitt at Harvard, and these weren't just grassroots complaints about the state of the country. It was coming from people in elite institutions that really saw America kind of transitioning into a new phase and maybe even falling apart.
So, Ryan, I want to come back to a few things that you said in just a minute, which dovetails neatly to the the beginning of your article. But let me go to Jane for a second before I come back to you. Jane, and this gets to the second half of my question: why then do people feel so bad right now? At the beginning of your piece, which is titled "The Winding Road to Justice," you write something that I find intriguing, which is that one explanation for Americans' anxiety about the state of our country is the tendency to think of history as being linear. That is, to think that it only moves in one direction. What do you mean by that, and why do you think that exacerbates people's anxieties?
Right. Well, thank you for that question. So, when we think of history, what we're really talking about is a set of competing narratives and stories. And so, one narrative says history is linear, always moving in a straight direction and almost inevitably towards progress. More of everything, better lives for everyone, scientific advancement. Think the State of the Union is good, right? When life is going well, whether for us personally or for the nation at large, according to our own idea of the good, we feel it's at least in part because of things that we do. But as I said before, when catastrophe strikes, and by that I mean the unexpected, then it becomes clear how little control we really have as individuals, and that can be very scary and destabilizing on an individual and a social level. It's anxiety provoking.
Um, Ryan, at the beginning of your essay, How We Got Here, you write that, and this is a point you just alluded to, and it's one that's very well taken, that none of the problems that we're wrestling with in our democratic politics at the moment are especially new. Um, but why does it seem then that everything has come to a head all of a sudden? What has changed? If the structural problems or the issues with our parties and their primary systems, for example, if those have been with us for a long time.
Yeah, it's a great question. And we're all sort of feeling our way to the answer these days, just because things do seem to have fundamentally shifted, as I write about in the piece and as is treated throughout the good issue that you put together. And I think what I'm referring to at the beginning of the essay is that, at least for the last 30 years or so, some of the problems that very smart analysts, including people who've written in the issue, have shown we have a primary driven political process. We've had weakening political parties. We've had Congress consolidate authority at the leadership level and kind of stripping away the policymaking functions of committees. These things go back a ways, not a super long time, but at least a generation. But it seems like things have really shifted a lot in the last 7, 8 years or so, just in terms of the way our politics gets measured. When you look at those survey questions that get asked over time about, whether or not you'd be okay with your son or daughter coming home from college dating someone of the opposite political party, or the way that people tend to think about others in politics, that has really changed. I mean, it has. We are sort of at each other's throats. And so what I hypothesized in the essay that I wrote is there's several different reasons why that's happened, but a primary one is that politics in America has become sort of the battleground for the culture wars in a way that's relatively new. That is, we've used political processes, elections, the media that we use to promote candidates, their ideas, every electoral cycle, to kind of mitigate these culturally charged issues, whether it's on gender or climate or race or what have you, or whether it's school curricula, all these different things that have become kind of a feature of our political life. And I think that's one of the things that's especially new. We've always had social issues as creating bright dividing lines between parties and coalitions within the parties. But we've become consumed almost nonstop, 24/7, with using our political processes to have these culture war fights and to form coalitions sort of based on where you come down on those issues. And that's a relatively new thing. And we can talk a little bit more about why that is and what to do about it later.
Well, sure. I mean, let me follow up by asking if you have a thesis about why this happened. Why did these cultural battles, which maybe should be better fought in other venues, migrate or get appropriated by the political our politicians or by the political process?
hmm I think there's a couple of answers to the question, or a couple lines of thought that you could follow. One that I would point out is that we've really nationalized our politics in many ways. you see, if you've ever worked in state policy and politics, which is an interesting place to be because you're dealing sometimes with hyper local issues, but then you're also dealing with national issues because states often are the recipients of federal funds. They have to form coalitions that sort of mirror what's happening nationally. You still will find in the legislative record of most states a lot of bread and butter issues being debated day to day, and maybe less time given to the culture wars. But in our national politics, it's that seems to be the place where this has really found a home. And I think there's a couple of reasons for that. One that I'll point out, and I pointed out in the essay as well, is that over the last generation, the political right in America, and this I'm not laying the blame at the doorstep, but I think this is an important point. The political right in America has kind of lost influence in the commanding heights of American culture, to use that term, the universities, the media, the corporate boardrooms, the role and influence of people who are political conservatives and cultural conservatives has really been diminished in those places. But where it's gained a lot in the 1970s, since the 1970s, is in our politics. And so that's become a place where people who want to essentially have their way or make their point known in the culture wars can go into the political process itself. And I think that's something really important to point out because not that long ago, people on the right politically were the loudest advocates for civil society, for these layers of institutions between the state and the individual, where these sorts of debates are often to be mitigated. And both sides of the political aisle now, left and right, have really and the left has a longer history with this. I mean, progressives have often used politics as a way to kind of wage culture wars as well as economic ones and other sorts of things. But you have kind of an agreement, not an actually written agreement, but kind of an agreement in practice on the left and the right now that our politics is the place where we're going to have these battles. And so some of the smart ideas about reforming our institutions would help with that. But I do think that's a driving factor in all of this.
So I'm going to, again, come back to this point about the intersection between culture and politics, because I think it's so rich and important. But Jane, I want to go back with you for a second to this theme of how people feel about what's happening politically and why. And I want to focus on the period, the time period that you discuss in your piece, which is an earlier, much uglier phase of US history, namely the massive disenfranchisement of Black Americans following the US Civil War, which lasted roughly until World War II, although the work to address that disenfranchisement took longer. In describing this period, you note one shift that I found really, really striking, a shift in attitudes. First, you cite a poll from 1942 in which 2/3 of white Americans surveyed said that they thought that Black Americans were basically happy with the way things were, despite the manifestly terrible way in which so many Black Americans were then treated. But you then point out that the same poll just 2 years later revealed a very dramatic reversal in the attitudes of white Americans. By 1944, you write, about 2/3 of white Americans had come to realize that Black Americans were not happy with the status quo. So what happened in those 2 years that explains this massive sea change in attitude or awareness?
Excuse me. So, right, obviously what happened was World War II. Um, I want to leap in just for a second on this question of cultural
Mhm.
politics, because I think especially if we look at the war, we look at any kind of history of minorities in America, what some people call cultural politics is really values. It's not so much what's on television, but really core beliefs that people have about their society, what society should do, how to do it. So I think that calling it cultural sort of seems like it's taking it out of the realm of politics when it belongs at the very core of politics. Now, excuse me, about World War II in a nutshell. And I think we can agree that World War II is an inflection point in American history in a whole kinds of different ways. But it is especially noteworthy as a point where some white Americans who really maybe hadn't thought much about what life was like in other parts of the country or for other kinds of people were confronted with the grim realities of life as a Black person in America. both in the nation, but especially in the Jim Crow South. And they came into that realization in different ways. I was going to say one of the good things about a war, that's not the right way to put it. But one thing about mass mobilization uh, that was healthy for the United States was that it mixed everybody up. And so it brought people from the North and the South together. It brought people from the West Coast. Um, People were in very unfamiliar surroundings. They met new people. Um, and they were young. We're talking about my kids, right? The 18 to 22-year-old group of draftees. They were young, they were curious, they were interested in meeting each other and asking each other's questions. Um, so that's one reason. I think there was a certain openness on the part, especially of people involved in the war effort, which is just so strange, to them on every level. The other thing that happened is that African Americans, in the form of their leadership, their cultural institutions, their political institutions, seized the opportunity of World War II to make the case for equality to the nation and to the world. And so there was a really broad-based campaign to open the eyes of white Americans everywhere to the conditions of Black life. And they did things like they had a slogan, double V, which they called victory at home and abroad. So don't just win the war abroad, win the war at home too against anti-democratic forces. Um, there was President Roosevelt had his four freedoms. African Americans added a fifth. They wanted freedom from segregation. And they especially, throughout 1942 to 1944, really emphasized the dissonance between fighting a war for democracy and the sorts of Jim Crow institutions that ruled the South and that were prevalent in other places as well.
So what I find really one of the things I find so interesting about your discussion is that the conditions that Black American veterans and their white allies started responding to during and following World War II had existed for a long time. But then when change started to happen, it seems like it started to happen fast. And I wonder whether when you look at the grand arc of American history, whether that tends to be the pattern more often than not, that rather than slow, and this may get back to your point about history not being linear at the beginning, right? That rather than the arc of history always consistently bending towards justice and this things sort of progressing slowly but steadily, we have instead these moments of punctuated equilibrium, right? Where things are seem to be or are the same way for a long time. And then all of a sudden they reach a critical turning point and things start to snowball and change quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think you have big breaks in what's happening on the ground. Obviously, again, the Civil War is a prominent example of that, but there are lots of other examples. And one of the things that's I think is interesting that goes against the kind of linear idea is that these sorts of events are not experienced the same way by everyone. And so one thing, I like to think of history more in terms of switchbacks, that you're kind of going in one direction, going another direction, and hopefully you're going up the mountain the whole time, and justice might be at the top of that, but it's not consistent. And one of the problems, I think, or not a problem, one of the challenges of narrating this thing we call history is that events like this can be experienced in contradictory ways and produce very contradictory narratives. And so, again, thinking about the Civil War, one person's loss in that war can literally be another's liberation. So, how do you tell a coherent story about that, one that takes into account cause and effect, that has a plot line? And it can be very, very difficult. I think the history of the South, in particular, is hard to have a kind of coherent narrative that always moves forward, in part because you have these clashes that go on for decades and decades, where you have enfranchisement, then you have disenfranchisement, then you have reenfranchisement, then you have resistance to that. So it's never just one direction, and people don't experience the same thing in the same way.
Right. Ryan, I'm curious if you could say a little bit more about what about Jane's point about um, culture and values, and about the what you think is the appropriate role for the central or federal government, and what is more appropriately left to the states, because the civil rights battle, right, really, where if not for federal action at all kinds of critical moments, we wouldn't have seen the progress that we had.
Mhm.
Really brings the question of what is best dealt with at a national level, and what is, in your view, more problematic when it's dealt with nationally, as you argue some of our current culture wars are causing problems.
Yeah, so let me go back since we're talking about the middle of the 20th century. Just I know I didn't write about this in my piece, but I have written about this elsewhere to kind of illustrate what I was getting at. Clearly, the federal government is required for a whole bunch of things that we don't need to go through and delimit here, from our national defense to essentially universally applying the Constitution in the form of civil rights as we did in the 1960s and that whole era. But it's not just a question of the federal government versus the states. It's also this question of other institutions through which these sorts of developments can happen, where certain types of cultural achievements happen, maybe in partnership with the government, but sometimes outside of it. And I think going back to how I started this discussion, talking about things about 100 years ago, being relatively dire in terms of how people were perceiving the quality and health of American institutions, you see this kind of march towards collectivism in Europe that was a great concern to people here. There were some advocates for, people wouldn't use the word collectivism, but for essentially modeling what was going on in Europe and adopting a stronger federal government and sometimes curtailing checks and balances within it. There was this concern. And there was a concern that this was also happening in higher education, where we were losing our confidence in the sort of liberal education model that our universities had been based on, and there was an importation of the German social sciences model. And there were cultural critics. I mentioned, one or two of them earlier who were talking about this. And then something really interesting happens when you have the Depression, and then you in the 30s, and then you have the war in the 40s. Over this kind of 20-year stretch from the beginning of the Depression and up through the Second World War and a little bit after that, you see things like the Great Books program gets created at the University of Chicago with an antecedent at Columbia, and that was a very self-aware effort to kind of counteract what they saw as getting rid of some of these classical ideas that a Western liberal education was supposed to be based upon. You see the formation of the Mount Pelerin Society after World War II to kind of bring a new thinking about economics into the way that we regulate our economies or don't, which really ended up, when you look at the 20th century, having tremendous impact on the way that we do economic policy in this country. But that was, again, a group of people formed to kind of push back on what they saw as a dangerous collectivist model. You can even look at the correspondence between C.S. Lewis and J.R. Tolkien. It's been documented in Joe LeConte's good book. If you have kids and you've seen the Narnia or the Hobbit series stuff, you know it for that. But they were very self-aware as writers, using their craft to try to recover some of these notions of hearth and home and Western virtue, that they saw these overarching impersonal forces, both large governments and large corporations, as sort of stamping on. You can go down through a number of examples. My point is this: throughout that period of time, in terms of restoring health to our institutions, it wasn't just seen as something that you could do by adopting a certain approach to federal policy. It was kind of multi-pronged, and it involved what we might call the institutions of civil society, broadly construed to mean our institutions of education, the way that we publish and consume certain literature. There were multiple different ways, and there were lots of associations also formed during this time, kind of national associations to take care of a whole bunch of different things. That seems to be, to me, what's missing today in our debates about what we might call a culture wars, that we've kind of gone all in on politics as the place where we want to have these debates. And I'm not saying you shouldn't have these debates in politics, but there's some things we just can't expect our politics to do for us. And we could achieve perhaps more progress in some of these areas if we had sort of a multi-pronged approach like that once again.
Thanks. That's interesting, and there's a lot there. But Jane, I want to come back to you for a slightly different question, which is, um, does your study of history and the period at which we were just discussing, and the battle for the rights of African Americans and other minorities in the United States over time, does it lead you to any conclusions about what it takes to accomplish big reforms in the United States? And does that in turn tell you anything about our current struggles that you can share with our listeners?
Right. Thank you. So I really appreciate what Ryan was saying about the messiness of the mid 20th century. I think that the first thing we can do to make things better right now, and that uh, we don't want ever in our politics, is violence. We don't want street violence in American politics. That was one of the things that was happening in Europe in the 30s, that was eroding their democratic uh, institutions, and that the United States really didn't have in the 1930s. We had some isolated moments of violence, but not usually directed at our political institutions per se. So violence in the streets is never a good thing for a democracy, for a republic. Um, I think Ryan got at another thing that I think is very important for America today, which would be some better civic education. Um, you know, it sound like Sandra Day O'Connor, who spent the last portion of her career, her life, pushing for education in civics, in American history, in how government works. And I see that really missing. And sometimes it's because um, some people think that it's politically opportunistic to say, don't be down on America. But I think it's important for Americans to get a pretty honest appraisal of the good and the bad, the warts and the not warts in their past. And so I would say civic education would be a really good, it's not an antidote to what's happening today, but I think it might change the discourse to a great extent.
Interesting. Okay, this stuff is so fascinating. I could easily hog the questions for the next half hour, but I promised I would start bringing the audience, so I'm going to do that. Uh, Let me start with the following question, which was sent in by one of our audience members when they registered. And it's sort of well, I'll ask you both to respond to it because it dovetails or connects with so much of what you both have talked about, which is what can ordinary citizens not connected to government, not connected to academia, so neither setting the political nor the cultural agenda, as it were, or the discussion. What can they do to change things for the better? Ryan, why don't you start, and then Jane, you can come back in.
Sure. Well, most of us live out our lives and experience America in our local communities, and there's a lot that can be done in terms of people that want to be agents of change by getting involved in their communities. I mean, when you think about some of the issues that are top of mind for people, and for the last 5 years or so, when I was at AEI, before I escaped Washington, D.C. to get back to Austin, Texas, I was at the American Enterprise Institute, and we did large national surveys for a number of years, and the AEI continues that work. And, even in the height of the summer of 2020, after George Floyd's killing, and we were in the middle of the COVID pandemic, and people were really kind of activated by all of those things, even during those times, when you ask people what they were most concerned about in their communities, it's still a lot of bread and butter issues. People are still concerned that they're not going to be able to afford a home, or that their kids who are starting out, right after they graduate from school, or are not going to be able to afford a home. People were worried about the safety of their streets. They were worried about violence in the streets. They were worried about the quality of their kids' schools. That one really became a big issue during the COVID pandemic, just because of what happened to schooling. And that's been pretty durable. So you wouldn't realize this if all you paid attention to were presidential politics and presidential primaries and the kinds of things that we have to endure every day listening to that. That actually, for probably 62 to 68% of Americans, depending on which survey you want to look at, when you ask them to name like the top 3 to 5 issues that they're most concerned about, they're local bread and butter issues. And these are typically things that can be dealt with at the local level. Housing, the cost of housing is really driven by decisions made at the municipal level and some at the state level. The quality of our schools, again, something that we really deal with at the state level and at the community level. And even when it comes to policing and crime and partnerships with law enforcement, again, that's a local thing. There's a lot that people could do to at least restore the confidence of the people in their communities and the institutions that govern them. And that's where I think a lot of our energies should be. And hopefully, to some degree, if we have more people engaged in their communities, we could always stand to have more people kind of volunteering and giving their time to these sorts of things in their community, or running for school board, or what have you. My hope is that if you in these periods of American history, when you see greater kind of civic engagement that way, it also does tend to filter up into our national politics as well. And so I think more local engagement, it's certainly not a singular antidote as well, but in terms of a seasoning effect on our national discussions and what our primary candidates are talking about, could certainly be positively influenced by that.
Thanks, Ryan. And Jane, I imagine you have a lot to say about this question, given your study of the civil rights movement. Um, Talk a bit about the role that I hate the word ordinary Americans, but Americans who are not typically engaged in politics or in national affairs can play in these big issues.
Right. I mean, there are a lot of roles that they can play, including, unfortunately, by threatening democratically elected officials, by making the lives of members of local school boards miserable. I'm not sure if I would want to run for the school board these days, when what it means is that all of my personal information is placed online and people start calling my house and saying they want to kill me. Um, that's local. And so I think we don't want to romanticize the difference between hearth and home and the national level. I think one thing we could all do as Americans is stand up to that and say, stop shouting people down, stop bullying people. How on earth could you say that to someone? I mean, really, I would like to see more people just stand up and sort of say, shame on you. Um, that's not how we talk in this country, because it's really gotten very ugly, and you can't expect ordinary Americans to risk themselves to run for public office if all they're going to get is really, really nasty stuff in return. I mean, in the good old days, you could only be threatened by letter. Somebody had to really go out of their way to write you a threatening letter in Congress, and then somebody else opened the envelope first, and they put it in a pile marked threatening letters, and they handed it to you. But now, because of media, I think public servants, as much as anybody else, are vulnerable to nonstop communication with the public, and some of the forms of that communication are completely unacceptable. So that's one thing I would put out there. Obviously, another thing to do is for people to make sure that we have, as much as possible, um, accessibility to vote. Because if you think, what is the definition of the republic? If you think that ultimately it's by the government, the government by the people and for the people, then you have to have participation. And so clearly, more Americans should step out and participate in the electoral process, as well as working at local levels for other things. Um, you need that process to be accessible, and you need to have a sense that it's as level of playing field as possible. So things that limit the suffrage don't help with that. Um, you know, People who constantly question the integrity of the electoral process don't help with that. So again, I think we need a sort of recognition that by participation we can all vote, but we also all need to speak as well.
Ryan, I would love it if you could touch on two things in particular that Jane just talked about, and they're also in your piece, and they're also have just been mentioned by readers in individual questions. And the first is the role of morality, appeals to morality or common values, whether it's sort of common sense, decorum, and what's appropriate for public or political dialogue and what's not. Um, and then the tricky territory that appeals to morality can get us into, right? And then the second issue is social media, which, as Jane said, has accelerated everything. And as you talk about in your piece, has played, and many others make this point as well, played a really negative role by allowing us to sort of marinate in media ecosystems of our own or the algorithms concocting. But the audience question, which I think is a good one, is can you see social media playing a positive role as well?
Yeah.
So that was a
Um,
lot that I just threw at you. Take it
Yeah, no,
however.
that's fine. I take it in order. I mean, on the question of morality, and I would say public morality, I mean, I think Jane's right. There's a certain conscience that the majority of people would have that if you just call out this behavior that's just not only unhealthy but ruinous to our institutions, that's worth doing. I mean, you're actually calling people to a certain type of moral behavior in the public square that's a legitimate and very real thing that I would argue most people actually in their heart of hearts actually know is right.
Mhm.
I think that there's this really strange anthropological aspect of who we are as creatures where we tend to get very exercised by the abstract and by ideologies. I mean, you can turn out a bunch of people to march on the National Mall over an idea. And when our politics is about that, sometimes you can achieve great things and sometimes you can create chaos. I mean, first instance I can see of this talked about is in the like 1740s in the Scottish writer David Hume writing about how when their political parties get obsessed with like these ideas, people can become violent. And so you need to have kind of a politics of principle of just practicality as well that we talk about trying to actually solve real solutions to practical problems and using our politics for that, and then promoting the kinds of virtues and ideas and habits that are required for that thing. And I also agree with Jane that can be done a lot through civic education and through an understanding of what it means to actually be involved in the public. You know, one of the great things that kind of proceeded from this Enlightenment era that America was founded in, and in the English speaking world in particular, was that there was this kind of ennobilization of just the virtues of commerce and everyday life. You know, getting away from virtues that stem specifically from religion,
Mm.
although that's all important. But in terms of like the theological virtues and all the discussions that you would hear about virtue if you went to university back then, sort of shifts in that era to these discussions about things like the virtues of thrift and hard work, the virtues of treating people as colleagues in the public square, that you have to give the virtues of giving and taking, and all that's required of us when we actually kind of roll up our sleeves and get involved in our community. So I think we should talk openly about these things. And when we have public leaders that are embodying exactly the opposite, we should call that out as well. You know, to pull kind of an analogous page out of a different sort of story, and you look at like smoking cessation over the last generation in America. You know, we've got all kinds of warnings on cigarette packages, and we've got all kinds of, you know, if you're in Europe or in the UK where I spend some time, there's all those horrific pictures of people, you know, their throats rotting on the sides, and none of that seems to actually stop people from smoking. You can tax it more. There's lots of public policy things you can do. But the most powerful thing was that we just changed our opinion about this over time by people actually just talking about the effects of this public health issue. And it went from being something that was cool in the movies to do to something that gets you like an R rating in things to do. And I think in terms of our public discourse, we probably haven't been bold enough on requiring that of our public leaders and just calling out what we know to be the case, and knowing that people will resonate with it. People want a certain type of kind of moral fortitude in the public square that shows up in the polls all the time. People are kind of exhausted by what our politics has become.
Interesting. And I would love to follow up on that, but I'm going to take a question from a reader because I promised to. Joe in DC asks, our democratic system depends on the willingness of individuals to accept and abide by norms, rules, laws, and institutions. Sometimes, however, and Jane, you've already pointed this out, when it comes to slavery, for example, challenging the system is vitally important to our nation's progress. And we don't get progress without challenges. But more recently, we've seen a lot of challenges to our system, which do not seem to be positive or helpful. So, in the spirit of looking for solutions, Joe asks, how do we ensure that the challenges remain peaceful and lawful? That is, either they're the right kind of challenges, or even if they're the wrong kind of challenges, they're still made in a way that doesn't do damage to our system.
That's a great question. Kind of as kind of an unusual answer to that, which would be, I talked before about the importance of, a clean electoral system, one that's transparent, one that people have confidence in. That's something that has held this country together since the Civil War. One of my favorite characters in history is Oliver Wendell Holmes, who lives for a very long time. So it's always interesting to see how he changes over his life. So he fought in the Civil War. He was with Massachusetts. He was wounded. He saw 4 times. He saw horrors. And so one of his conclusions was that abstractions are not useful in politics, that abstractions can overheat. People can become so dedicated to their ideas, they're willing to turn to violence to defend them. And so for him, he said, we can have, a democracy, but everybody has to participate. He said something really interesting about 20 years later, after passage of the 16th Amendment in 1912. For those of you who don't keep count, that's the federal income tax. Which he was all in favor of. He was very loud about it. He kept saying, "I like to pay taxes." He said, "With them I buy civilization." And what he meant from that wasn't museums. What he meant was civic peace, and that it was important for our country to survive peacefully, which was always his preoccupation, to have a floor below which nobody would fall. And so he said at one point, you can have democracy, you can have great disparities in wealth, you can't have both. So he wanted to see a government, whether at the local level or the federal level, that was humane and dedicated to making sure that everyone in our country had their basic needs covered, so no one would feel compelled to turn to violence. And so that everyone, I think that a lot of the politics right now, we talk about the politics of despair. There could be a lot more done to help people out of that at the most basic level.
So that's sort of the supply side answer, right? But is there a demand side answer as well? That is, rather than a top down, a bottom up answer. That that if, and this may get back to your question about, your point about sort of having an accepted set of rules about what is acceptable in our politics and what is not when it comes to individuals or groups of individuals challenging the system. Do you think there's work to be done there as well?
Yes. One of the reasons that the United States won World War II in part because we produced more stuff. We had ugly airplanes, but we had lots of them. We had ugly ships, really ugly ships, but we had lots of them. And one of the reasons for that is we could expand our labor force to let women into it as well. And the Rosie the Riveter. Well, women can only work when their families can be taken care of. So we had lots of private and public daycare during World War II so that you could drop your kid off at the Kaiser factory, go do your job, pick up a hot meal to take home to your family for dinner when you picked up your kids, and go home. And that sounds really, really good to me as somebody in the workforce. And I think that there are lots of things that we could do. I think that lots of Americans are very clear about what they need and want done. What we'll see in the coming years will be, I think, especially with women in the workforce, well, I'm not going to put this right, but how much the economy can tolerate before we start actually doing things that will help make it possible, like in World War II, for women to fully contribute in the workforce. So that's one way of saying it's not a mystery what Americans want. They want healthcare. They want roofs over their heads. They want jobs. They want good jobs. They want trains not to derail and spill chemicals. It's really not a big mystery what most people want at the ground level and as a base level.
Mm-hmm. Ryan, a related question from a reader, which is simply, why is political compromise seen as so difficult when history, you both make this point, proves that it's absolutely necessary? And you can bring it if you want, whether it seems particularly difficult today or whether political compromise has always been difficult.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I mean, you can go back to the founding of the country and in the years that followed that. And, there was some pretty crazy stuff that was happening, when you had, people like Thomas Jefferson and, and Alexander Hamilton actually, while on the federal payroll, like running their own newspapers basically out of their government offices and attacking each other, making up things about each other, and so compromising in that environment sometimes was very challenging. So our situation is not entirely without precedent. But I think that, there's something to be learned just from these polls about Americans' confidence in their political institutions over time. And the fact that, since Pew's been asking this question from the 1970s onward, you see this kind of steady drop in confidence in the federal government, mostly. But then you see state confidence in state governments kind of collapsing along this same trend line. But the confidence in local government is about the same as it was in the 70s. It's, roughly, 70%, three-quarters of people basically trust their local government. Does that mean that local governments are like, free of graft and corruption? Of course not. I mean, some of the most egregious examples of these sorts of things happen at the local level, but there's something about the proximity or knowing that the
Right.
people making policy decisions are
Really,
like living in the same
right.
community that I am, and that somehow keeps people's yeah, confidence, more elevated there. And so I think that the challenge for us is how in this declining, confidence in our kind of especially federal government and its ability to do its job. How do you actually get that to be a place where compromise can happen again, where it seems like people's confidence would probably be boosted if they saw their leaders actually taking on challenges that the majority of Americans actually care about, whether it is with regard to healthcare or something that the federal government could do to create incentives for states and localities to do the right thing when it comes to housing supply or whatever, and our labor policies. I think that this is where we get into some really important issues about the incentives just in our electoral process that I think we are going to need to fix, so that what people are actually debating in primaries is also what they're debating in the general election about some of these things that people actually care about. And until we do that, I think these confidence levels are gonna stay really low. And I think it's worth us asking, why is it that people have more confidence in what's local when there's also deep divisions in a lot of local communities? But there's something about the fact that people share common interests. They share the same parks, they drive on the same roads and all stuff that people just kind of assume they're going to figure out how to get the big questions right because they have that common interest. And that's what we're
Well, let me
lacking
get you
kind of
to,
in our federal government is the common interest. And I
so
really do think that's going to get us into both congressional and electoral reforms to fix that.
okay, so I have to ask you about the implicit question that you just raised. You both said in different ways and at different times, and readers have picked up on this in their questions as well, that we have a political establishment, and this is not original observation, that in so many ways, in both sides of the aisle, does not reflect what most people care about, what most voters care about the most. And we see that with what's happening in Washington over the last few days, where we have this crazy deadlock where one party is holding hostage the prospects of moving forward on all of these very broadly popular national priorities, when in the other chamber we have a compromise that could allow us to do that. I mean, I know this is an enormous question, but what are some of the factors that you feel have led our national political parties or political actors to become so disconnected from the issues that exercise voters the most, Ryan?
I think we've been gerrymandering districts for a long time. We've been, drawing these lines for a long time in ways that have helped contribute to how we see things today. But we have been doing that for a long time. And I think what has really happened in the last generation is that the role of the parties in deciding kind of who runs and what they run on has really been diminished in our politics. And as someone who has spent quite a bit of time in the UK, used to live over there, both my kids went to university there. I like it over there. I like it during election season too, because it's like really short. They announce it, they campaign for a couple of months and it's over. But
Yeah.
they still, they still actually will tell people you're not ready to run or to stand in their case, for office. And for all kinds of understandable reasons, we've wanted to make our our politics more popular and to push back against the smoke-filled room politics of overly strong parties. And that's all understandable. And you go back a generation, and I can see why arguments on behalf of kind of weakening the hold of parties over local elections was what it was. But sometimes the pendulum needs to swing, and I think we're at a point now where we need to recover some institutional heft. So I think that's one of them. And then I think also Congress has just weakened itself. It's really consolidated kind of policymaking at the top, and it's become very ideological. And you don't really have incentives when you're in Congress anymore to kind of work your way up through the ranks to get these committee assignments where real policy is done. That still happens, but not in the way that it used to. And we used to allow even disagreement within parties when committees would have sort of overlapping jurisdictions on issues, because each committee would do its work. And we sort of stripped that away so it doesn't attract the kind of grown-ups that we want. And in fact, it seems like most of the grown-ups are retiring. So I think there's something about the way that we our parties have weakened when it comes to the elections that we hold, and then the way that Congress goes about doing its business that need to be reformed. Unfortunately, Congress is really about the only thing that can reform itself in this regard, and that's going to take kind of an enlightened leadership in both parties to step forward and put forward some real reforms. But my guess is you could actually make a pretty good career for yourself if you wanted to do that, just because you would win a lot of plaudits from a lot of American people.
Jane, I have two readers' questions which are on similar topics, and we're all almost out of time, so I'm going to cluster them together. And they both, I think, pick up on an implication of your piece, which is, could another war or an economic crisis help unify our country? And then the second question is, we as a nation have recently gone through extraordinary traumas, including the COVID pandemic, the murder of George Floyd, the January 6th uprising, inflation, etc. And yet none of those have made the difference and brought us together or created a unified effort that could succeed in addressing these deep problems. So what will or would or could it take to break, as the reader writes, the fever of polarization, since none of those crises have?
Right. Good question. I think I'd come to something that Ryan wrote about in his piece, um, which is primaries. He alluded to that when he said maybe we don't want to go back to the, I guess now non-smoke filled back rooms. But the primary system has given a stranglehold in many places to the most extreme elements of either party. And it's a commonplace in Europe to say American politicians are the only ones who choose their votes, their voters, rather than voters choosing their politicians. And they've worked it so that they don't have to appeal to the margin anymore. They can just be as extreme as possible and get these tiny little primary votes, which are unrepresentative, perhaps even of their districts, but certainly unrepresentative of states as a whole or the country as a whole. So we end up with people who I think Ryan rightly characterizes as less than adult in Congress. I'm not sure if we have to wait for Congress to try to work this out themselves. I'm not sure how that's going to work. I think that there are movements at the local level to change the way primary elections are run, to change the way that voting. I think California right now has like they have the system where the top two people who win the primary then are the I'm going to get this wrong anyway. There are other systems.
I can tell you,
Representational
Alaska
voting.
and Maine, two states have moved to what they call a Final Four primary system, right? Where you have an open primary and everybody gets to vote, and then the top four candidates advance, and then you do ranked choice. So as they drop out, the votes move on to the remaining candidates. Yeah,
I think that would certainly give the middle a bigger voice. The candidates would have to appeal to a broader segment than just their supporters to try and gain some of that. And that would help move us back, I think, towards more of a political equilibrium, which we used to have, but then have really lost in the last, 30, 40 years.
so it's not that our crises haven't been big enough to spur change, but that they're occurring in a context where our system does so much to block change and make it difficult to achieve.
Yeah, our system has always blocked a lot of change. I think back to what Ryan was saying about seniority in Congress, and of course, Southern Democrats had their region and indeed the nation in a throttle hold during the 1930s and 40s. You couldn't get any legislation passed if you were Democratic president without the South going along, and so. And they were head of the committee chairs. So that is an institutional problem that maybe Congress could fix, but I don't think a war is gonna do it. I hope that a natural disaster doesn't do it. A pandemic's definitely a bad idea. I think we don't necessarily need cataclysmic events to to generate passion.
Mhm. Well, I hate to say that we're out of time, but that's actually a surprisingly positive note on which to end. That we don't need a crisis. We can do it without a cataclysmic event.
Yeah,
Um, the power
yeah,
is in our hands. This has been such a great conversation, and it's a sign of how deeply learned and how smart the two of you are. That everything that you say opens up an entirely separate conversation that we could spend an hour on each one of them. But an hour total is all we had. So I want to thank Jane Dailey and Ryan Streeter so much for writing pieces for the Catalyst and for this conversation, which I found absolutely fascinating. Um, to our audience, thank you also so much for joining us. We couldn't do this without you. If you enjoyed what you heard today and you want to read more, you can find Jane and Ryan's articles and the rest of the new issue at the Catalyst of the Catalyst at bushcenter.org/catalyst. Please join us soon for more good stuff. I'm Jonathan Tepperman. Thank you all so much for zooming in, and I hope to see you again soon. Bye-bye.